for joining me. Today, I have a special interview for those of you interested or thinking about running an Airbnb out of your home or an investment property. So here with me today is Jessie, and I'm going to throw it over to her for a quick introduction.
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Carolyn, for having me. I'm Jessie Mackaness. I'm an attorney here in San Diego, and along with my husband, we host 2 different Airbnb properties here, and we have for some time now.
Cool. About how long have you been in the Airbnb space?
So I bought my home in University Heights, which is a little neighborhood north of North Park, and in 2013. And then 2 years into that, I moved away and rented out my house on Airbnb throughout all of 2015. Yeah.
Okay.
And I moved back in early 2016. So that was my brief foray into Airbnb. And I was very successful with it. I was astonished because I didn't know if I was going to be able to keep my house. And if it weren't for Airbnb, I wouldn't have been able to. So I'm very thankful for it. A little bit protective of it, probably because of that. But I understand some of the issues that some Airbnb properties and hosts aren't as quite respectful as neighborhoods as maybe I was. So I get the tension there, but I'm a big proponent of Airbnb if it's done correctly. But I took some years off. And then when I got together with my now husband, he had a rental property downtown in a condo in East Village, San Diego, which is a fantastic location.
It is.
But every HOA has different CC&Rs that limit or provide some kind of restrictions on rentals. And his had restrictions for how many nights that you can rent it out. So he always thought he couldn't do Airbnb. And I was like, let's look into it because Airbnb is pretty awesome. So we pulled the CC&Rs and we reviewed it, and he actually had a 26-night minimum, which is a lot, but it's not doable on Airbnb. So we put it up on Airbnb in early spring 2019, and it's been rented out almost nonstop since then.
Wow.
And really, really successful. Even with the 26-night stays, we've had a great success there. And then we bought a home and moved out of my old home that I used to rent out. So that's back on Airbnb since July. And so now we've got 2 properties current on Airbnb, and that's our history.
Awesome. That's great. So you mentioned briefly, I just want to jump in, that you wouldn't have been able to keep your house had it not been for the Airbnb. So can you just talk just a little bit about the main reason that is?
Sure. So long-term rentals, obviously, you're not going to get as much revenue there.
Yeah.
Airbnb exponentially increases your revenue, sometimes doubles it, honestly, depending on the particular property. So if I had gone long-term rental, I would have taken quite a loss every month. That might not be the case anymore. This is in 2015. I may be able to break about even if I did long-term rental now, but it's definitely not an area in which you can really expect a lot of cash flow in San Diego. San Diego is not a cash flow rental environment. It's more so for appreciation. But via Airbnb, you can actually get cash flow from properties, and that's what makes it so unique here. So that's how I was able to stay in it. I was able to cover my mortgage and then the cost of everything because of it. So, but I was really lucky that I bought a type of property, which you may want to ask as a follow-up question about the types of property that would be good on Airbnb. I was really lucky that the property that I had owned just happened to be a very good property for Airbnb, which is not why I originally purchased it.
That actually leads greatly into my first main question for you. If someone were considering buying a property for Airbnb or possibly turning their home into an Airbnb space, what are some things, or maybe the number 1 or 2 things that you would recommend, even as far as property types or locations, just anything that's really pertinent to the San Diego area?
The number 1 thing, and you're a realtor, you know this, it's location. Location is everything with an Airbnb. From my experience being a host on Airbnb and then also an avid user of Airbnb on the traveling side, what I've seen personally is there's 2 types of properties that are successful on Airbnb. The first is properties that have an extremely high walkability score. So ones that are close to restaurants and coffee shops and bars and other types of attractions. It doesn't need to be in the heart of downtown of the city or anything like that, but it has, San Diego has many eclectic neighborhoods that have a walkable heart. Rentals that are near those types of areas do so much better. Vacationers often don't want to rent a car. Some do, but they often don't want to. So they don't want to have to use a taxi or an Uber every time to get to these like small conveniences. The second type of property I've seen do really well on Airbnb are ones that have more of like a retreat oasis type of feel. It's
Okay.
the woods or the mountains by the beach and on a canyon, but it has this private feel and this like unique, distinct flavor where it makes a vacationer feel like they're in a different type of environment. And so those obviously aren't going to have the same great walkability scores, but people are also going to be attracted to it because it provides something different than what they would have otherwise had. I would not recommend, and you see it on Airbnb probably yourself when you've searched around, I would not recommend trying to buy a property in like a suburban neighborhood and expect to do well on Airbnb. That doesn't mean that you might get some renters there, but it's not going to do as well as a property in those other two categories.
Yeah. And now from your experience too, which could be as an Airbnb user or a host, do you think it makes sense to rent rooms out in a home if you are sharing? Do you always look for private use homes when you look, or do you have an opinion on that?
I do. I always personally look for private use.
Me too.
I have stayed in types of bed and breakfast type of places where you share the property with the actual owner, and it can be uncomfortable and a little bit stuffy, particularly when there's shared bathrooms, or even there's no shared bathrooms, but shared kitchen space, not a private entry. It's just you feel like you're stepping on someone else's toes and you're not getting that full feeling of, I think people like to vacation because they want to pretend like they live in an area that's different and new, like just to experiment with it a little bit, like this is where we live. And you can't really get that fantasy when you are sharing, the kitchen with Mary.
Yes.
In the master bedroom, right? So, but I will tell you that might discuss this more later. The laws in San Diego are different with respect to home sharing rather than whole home renting. So there are some positives of home sharing.
Okay, we'll talk a little bit about that. It's totally, what are the laws, the differences, at least from your perspective and what you know, when you share a home versus when you rent out a whole place, and also any tax information you know about that, because I know they do vary.
Yes, they do. So you do have to get a permit if you are doing home sharing, because there has been some decisions in San Diego that compare home sharing to a bed and breakfast, and you need a permit to do that. I remember this case in like 2014 where this little old lady was renting out a bedroom in her home, and they found out about it and they fined her. I think it was close to $25,000.
Wow.
Ridiculous, because she was classified as a bed and breakfast and she didn't have the proper permit. So there are some permit type features that you have to do differently when you do home sharing, which makes it a little bit more complicated, but it looks like the framework in which San Diego is going to go with the new sets of laws, that it's going to be much more lax on home sharing. Actually, the new framework, the proposal that's going to be going around for a vote for the city council, doesn't look like it's going to have any limitations for home sharing. So that's a positive, because they're proposing quite a few limitations with respect to whole home renting.
Ooh, and I imagine that being more lax when you're sharing a home makes it quieter for your neighbors and everything to enjoy. If you're in the home when someone else is there, it's less likely they're going to throw a party or be rowdy or disturb the neighborhood at all. So
that's precisely why it was a concession reached. So what happened was the company that owns VRBO, which is actually media, and San Diego's Hospitality Union has been negotiating for the better part of a year on some kind of agreement between the two sides. So it's basically the hotels versus the vacation rental companies. And they came up with a framework where they had to both compromise big time on to push back and forth. The one thing that the San Diego hotels were willing to concede was the home sharing, for that precise reason that you just mentioned, is that there's this level of responsibility when the owner lives inside the home that things aren't going to get trashed, things aren't going to get loud, et cetera, that it's not going to disrupt the neighborhood. And there's probably less, as we talked about before, there's less demand for it. So it's probably not as threatening to the hotel.
Yes, absolutely. What would be some of your advice to maximize your profit when you're doing Airbnb? I'm not sure if you've done or experienced the Airbnb Luxe rentals, I believe they're called. Is that what they're called?
Yes.
The nicer ones, yeah.
Yeah, I have heard of them. I have not yet to stay in one.
Okay.
But even if you aren't classified under that higher tier luxe Airbnb type of rental, which, you know, it has to have a certain amount of net worth. It has to meet all these different checklist marks in order to be classified as such. But even if you're not in that area, it's really important, I think, to really get the most out of Airbnb, even when you are on the more budget side, is to still remember, even when a traveler or vacationer is traveling on a more budget side, they still want that escapism that we discussed before. Mm-hmm. So people get in a way, an attempt to feel that they're upgrading or changing their life in some way or another, even for a small period of time. They want to feel cooler, hipper, different in some way or another. So you want to help give them that fantasy. So I think one of the biggest things in San Diego that you can do to do that is to really you have to have a great eye-popping listing, because there's so many vacation rentals in San Diego. So the best way, I think, to maximize profit is to put some time and effort into your listing. That would be getting, you know, potentially an interior designer, if you don't really have a knack for it, to get more stylish, updated, modern furniture, wall art, nice bedding, to just make it look nice, and then to spend the extra money on professional photos. So there's a lot of listings out there where somebody's just gone around with their iPhone, didn't really even make the bed that neatly, and you know, not surprisingly, that they're always available for rent. So if you really want it, and that's what I've always stressed from the beginning, and I've had such low vacancy rates because of it.
That's awesome.
It's because of the just really putting the money into the interior design to make it look fresh and modern, and then also paying for that professional photographer who knows real estate. That's really, really important, because a professional photographer that's like a wedding photographer or a headshot photographer is not going to understand how to get into a property and make the space look the best that it can. The angles, you know, women like sometimes the kind of more downward look because it makes us look thinner. But if you win real estate, you actually kind of want to be lower to make the property look bigger. I'm sure you know this from helping with people listing and hiring photographers there too. So the same types of photographers that you would hire for a real estate listing are the ones that you want to get in there for your Airbnb photos. And it is worth the money for sure, because you can use those photos over and over again for years. Yes. That's the first impression the renters are going to see.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. What do you think about the types of expenses you spend on furniture and the items you mentioned? You know, it's like, do you go all out and get the really expensive mattresses and sheets and couches, or do you go a little bit more budget friendly because you know they're going to have some wear and tear?
Yes.
This is totally your opinion too, you know.
It's your opinion and what you're trying to accomplish here. If you're on the more budget end, it's fine getting bedding. That's a little bit more budget, as long as I would look at the reviews, make sure that's comfortable, touch it yourself, make sure that's all good to go. I would never spend too much money on furniture just because of the wear and tear, but I would recommend that it look nice. So IKEA might be a little bit on the cheaper end, but I think some furniture from IKEA is fine. I wouldn't go necessarily, you know, high end design furniture or anything like that. So I would just try to keep it budget friendly while still looking really nice, because these things are going to get some wear and tear to it. You need to understand that you need to replace it, particularly with the sheets. You're supposed to have 2 sets of sheets for every bed at all times clean. So if you've got 3 beds, that's, you know, it really gets exponential with respect to the cost for the sheets. And if there's a little stain on them, you know, people recommend getting white sheets because they want to see how clean the sheets are.
Yes.
In a rental. So if you have any of the littlest stains on a white sheet, you have to just replace the whole set of bedding, which can get really expensive. So I would go more towards the middle range if you're not sure. If you're definitely on the more budget side, you can go below, but just make sure that it's not something that somebody would touch and be like, no.
Yes.
So, and also rental conveniences, I think, is a really big thing that can distinguish your home. And I think that is absolutely worth the money. So we got these lamps that have USB ports in them right by the bedside. Just little things like that somebody who's coming in, imagine that they're staying here on vacation and they don't know where things are, and just to make their lives a little bit simpler, whether it be their coffee pot or the rental, the lamps, or, you know, make sure there's enough hangers in the closet for them to hang up their clothes. Yeah. Just try to think about all of those things and definitely put the money in there.
Yeah, that's really good. What do you think about other things that people should consider, like allowing pets, having property managers? Do you have regular cleaners, kind of those services that go along with Airbnb and some of the decisions you have to make?
It depends on what your job is. So in 2015, I worked as a full-time Airbnb host, and it was so much work. You're doing all the client communication, you're coordinating with the cleaning crew, you're refilling the supplies, you're overseeing the house maintenance. There's so much to be done. I knew this time around, it's not what I wanted to do.
Mm-hmm.
So I looked for and interviewed quite a few property management companies in San Diego, and I found one I really liked. And so far, they have been worth their weight in gold. I don't have to do any of the communications anymore. They go and refill paper towels being out, go buy a new set of sheets for me. Obviously, with my oversight, if I have any questions or anything like that, they coordinate with the cleaning crew about, late check-ins or late checkouts, early check-ins. And so that all has to be coordinated with the cleaning crew. It's so much work. And so I really personally recommend property management if you have a full-time job, and they charge between 10% if it's like a really long-term rental where they don't have to do as much, but typically it's more between 15 to 25%.
Okay.
It depends on your particular property. And you can, if you've already done a lot of the legwork on the front end, they'll usually charge lower, and that's all negotiable. So
Okay.
Remember that when you're going into it, like, well, this other company offered me this, I like you guys better, and just don't take their set rates as the end all be all. You can negotiate, but I find it to be totally worth it for property management. As far as pets, I really recommend allowing pets. I know not everybody feels that same way, but you can charge a premium if you allow pets, because pets these days, more and more people are treating their pets like family members, and
Sure.
They want a vacation with their family, and they have a difficult time finding a place that will allow pets. And so because of that, if you do allow pets and you've got a beautiful property, that to me, it makes up for any downside being able to charge that a little bit more. Yeah, okay, my place might be a bit more expensive, but your dog's welcome. Not only is your dog welcome, I have a doggy door and a backyard for them too. And they're willing to pay so much more because of it. And if you can do one or two things with respect to protecting yourself. You can ask for a pet deposit, or what we've been doing is just a general security deposit and an additional pet fee. So if anything, I think it's more lucrative to allow pets. But I know some people, really like their furniture and want to be more careful about what's allowed, or want to be sensitive to people who are allergic. That's one thing I have to disclose on my listing, that pets are allowed here. So if you do have any high allergies to dander or anything like that, this is not the place for you. But more often than not, it's that people are traveling with dogs that are much more grateful. I've gained more renters than I have lost them because
from doing it.
Mm-hmm.
I want to go back real quick to what you said about the property management price, because when you said that 15 to 20 to 25% is a big chunk. Now, you might not have your exact numbers yet, but at least for a feel for the last month or so with the property management company versus what you did in 2015. Do you still think you're turning a higher profit than a long-term rental, even with that additional fee?
Yes.
That's
yes, because so the last month was about, I think it was like $700 or $800. I can't remember. But even with that, that's all built in, because the prices in 2015 were actually lower than what they are now.
Sure.
Obviously, I'm still getting quite a bit of cash flow from that. And it's freed up so much of my time that I can actually work on my 9-to-5 job. So if you look at it that way, it's absolutely more beneficial to get a property management. And the reason why it's more than a long-term rental, because usually they're like 8 to 12% for long-term rental, is there's so much more work. There's so much more. We're talking about 2-day renter, 3-day renter, 2-day renter, 5-day renter, 3-day renter, and there's communications on the front end and the back end and during for each of them. It's tons. It's non-stop having to deal with these particular issues. I lock myself out. I lock myself out again. I had one renter lock themselves out 3 times in the span of 2 days. And I have to drive out there every single time to get them back in. So it's a lot of work, and that's why they charge more.
Now, do you have a tip, or would you recommend doing the keyless entries for just like little tips and tricks like that? Because I've seen those on Airbnbs just be such a smart investment of getting the locks that are $100 versus $50.
Yes, I think that we have a lockbox that's like attached to the house that has a code to get into it. But I really like the actual doorknob with the keyless entry for that reason, because the lockbox still has a lock, or a key that you can lose. So I think it's a really good investment, because people are just irresponsible. And even if they're responsible people, they're on vacation and doing lots of good things, they're going to lose these things. It makes it more convenient. Also, when I did the onboarding process in 2015, I always met with the renters, walked them through the property, showed them how to do and how to get around, how to turn on certain lights. And I thought they really liked it. But then as I was vacationing more on Airbnb, I realized that I was so much happier when there wasn't a host.
A host, yeah.
That I could just go in and get, have it feel like it's my home, and not have to, traveling all day and feeling all, not necessarily the most attractive, and having to talk to some stranger for 10 to 15 minutes or however long. So because of that, I have transitioned over to having my property manager completely available via Airbnb chat if there's any issue whatsoever, and tons of instructions, but allowing them to get in, self-check-in for themselves. And they've been really happy with that.
Okay, that's a good one. Self-check-in is important.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see, has COVID impacted your Airbnb experience? I know you weren't property management hosting, prior to that this year, but have you seen an increase or even a decrease in what's going on, or cleaning changes, anything like that?
My husband's condo was vacant for almost a month, and that was the only time it's been vacant since we started renting it.
Wow.
That was in part of April and May, really the heart of the quarantine, when everybody was really scared and nobody was doing, any kind of traveling. They just weren't sure how things were going to pan out. So it definitely took a downswing for the property that we already had up. But since June, we've had inquiries and booked fully. And then I've listed my house since July, and I was worried about it. So I reduced the rate a little bit for COVID, and it got booked solid through October within a couple weeks.
Wow.
I'm kicking myself a little bit. But it is what it is, because you don't know. You don't know until you try. And that's another thing with Airbnb, is that be confident in your rate and have patience. Right? Really, you have to look at things from a macro perspective. Wait a few months and see if you're not getting bites or not. Be patient with your rate and don't just keep dropping it. That was one of the biggest mistakes I made early on, is that I rented out my house for the first 2 months that I ever rented on Airbnb at this ridiculously low rate, because I was just so excited that somebody was inquiring. And then the month after, I doubled that rate from there on. I'm like,
wow.
Thinking, but you're nervous when you first list it about whether it's going to do well or not. So be confident and be patient, and don't reduce it too much. But as far as COVID goes, I think people are still wanting to vacation. The first bit, it was scary, but people are still wanting to go out there. And I think Airbnb is offering a really great option for people, because they still get to shelter in place in a home, but be in a different environment. Yeah. So I don't think that it's really taken too much of a dip, even though Airbnb's revenue apparently has gone down. They're still planning on going public this month. So
I saw that, yeah.
Yeah, they're optimistic. And from our numbers, I see why. Mm-hmm. People are still wanting to travel.
So do you have any last insight into kind of where the laws are going, or any changes you foresee that will positively or negatively impact you as an Airbnb host?
Sure. They've been debating the short-term rental laws in San Diego specifically for
forever,
5 years now.
Yeah.
And there's been lots of back and forth, bills that almost went through and became law and didn't. The city attorney opined that she didn't believe that short-term rentals were permitted in San Diego. That didn't really stick. So right now it's a wild, wild west. And I mentioned earlier that the Hospitality Union San Diego and the short-term rentals have reached an agreement, and the city just has to approve it. The agreement is not perfect. It's definitely a compromise, but it could really change the landscape for whole home renting, because the framework proposes to reduce whole home short-term rentals to 0.7% of the city's housing stock, which would be about 3,700 permits being issued. And there's currently over 16,000 short-term Airbnb rentals in San Diego. So that would drastically reduce. I think it's over 70% of the Airbnb listings that are out there right now. So I don't know if it's going to go through. It seems quite a big cut. There's been lots of scary talks like this over the years. Like, if this passes, we're screwed. If this passes, we're screwed. And then it never ends up happening. So I don't even know if this is going to happen either. But there's a lot of potential downsides to short term. But I will tell you that there's 2 bills in place in the California legislature for long-term rentals that are terrifying for an investor, because they basically make evictions nearly impossible right now with COVID, and you don't have to worry about those things with Airbnb because they all pay up front. So long-term rentals actually has quite a few. I'm so happy I don't have any long-term rentals right now, because I literally would not be able to evict until like mid 2021 if they stopped paying rent now. There's some of the proposals. So that's a lot of revenue that you're missing out on, and that you're having to not be able to cover your mortgage and whatnot. So I would say short-term rentals is still a positive way to go until something is set in stone. We don't know what's going to happen. And then you can always change your mind then. The market is great, as you know. Like, if you need to sell later on, you can. But I would feel comfortable getting into another short-term rental here as a way. It's a unique way to actually get cash flow in San Diego rather than just appreciation.
Yeah. Something I always recommend to anyone who's looking to invest, whether they're flipping, short-term or long-term renting, is to buy a property that can do all 3. It's like, if you need to sell it, sell it. If you want to go Airbnb, great, but make sure you can long-term rent it, and you're at least breaking even until the laws change or you get a permit or whatever, in case they do, because it's not always up to us what gets to happen. So
no, it doesn't. And being able to be flexible, I totally agree. That's the way to go there.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, is there any last minute things you want to add? Thank you very much for your time.
Of course. I would say another quick little tip that I recommend to get that 5-star rating up, because both of our rental units have near 5-star ratings, is little gifts for your renters go a really long way. So we leave either a bottle of wine or a gift certificate to a local brunch spot with a little note for them, often handwritten. It's a lot of work, I know, but it's always very meaningful to the renters, and it just provides that extra level of experience. And you can do this if it's more budget friendly or if you're on the more luxe side, but it leaves an impression. And it's kind of buying a 5-star review a little bit, but
it's the reciprocity law. It's okay.
Right. So I recommend being thoughtful like that if you really want to make a living and create a real Airbnb presence.
Yeah, that's awesome. Great advice. Thank you so much for your tips and tricks and time. And I super appreciate you.
Of course. Thanks, Carolyn, for having me.